Despite refusing to negotiate on the debt ceiling and budget reductions, President Biden insists it's Republicans who are holding the economy hostage. Here's what the president said earlier today in the Rose Garden.
The extreme MAGA Republicans have taken control of the House of Representatives, and they're holding our economy hostage by threatening to default on our national debt, a debt we've already incurred over 200 years unless we give in to the threats and their demands.
Joining me now to discuss this is Senator Pete Ricketts of Nebraska. He serves on the Senate Committee on the Environment and Public Works and the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. Senator Ricketts, welcome to Washington Watch.
Thank you very much for having me on. And it really is rich hearing President Biden talk about how Republicans are holding up the economy when the House has passed a responsible bill that controls our spending and also raises the debt limit. They've done their job. Now it's up to the president to do his job and come to the table and start negotiating. I know he did not fail Civics 101. He knows how this is supposed to work.
Well, I want to ask you about that, Senator, because you're fresh from being a governor, an executive of the state of Nebraska. The legislature passed a budget. You didn't like it. You couldn't just walk away and say, "Hey, it's your fault." Does it not require that the two entities sit down and come to a solution?
Yeah, absolutely. As governor, I proposed a budget, but it was just a proposal. The legislative branch is the one that actually, in our system of checks and balances, has the responsibility of passing a budget. Now, in Nebraska, they generally did about 95% of my recommendations, but it wasn't universal. And that's when I had to negotiate with the legislature with regard to what we would be spending money on. And this is no different for the president. He knows he needs to step up and negotiate. This is part of his role as president. He owns it. The buck stops with him. He needs to come and negotiate. This is not new. 7 out of the last 10 times that this has happened, the executive branch has had to negotiate with the legislative branch. President Trump negotiated with Nancy Pelosi when she wanted more spending. Now we actually want something that is more reasonable. We want to control spending. I mean, our spending since 2019 is up 54%. Our population is only up 1.8%. American family knows at the end of the day, you have to live within your means, and nobody wants to default on the debt. The president has to quit dodging this and show some leadership for a change and actually step up and negotiate.
Now, Senator, I was talking about this yesterday, but I think the Democrats kind of think this is status quo, that the Republicans will cave on this, because they have in years past. But there's something different this time. You have conservatives in the House. You have a speaker that's resolute on this. And you're one of, I think, like 43 Republicans who have signed a letter saying, hey, Mr. President, you're going to have to negotiate with the speaker because we're standing with the House.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about the accomplishment that Speaker McCarthy did. He got Republicans, House Republicans, to vote on a budget and raise the debt limit. Many of these folks had never voted to raise the debt limit. And so he's done his job. And what Senate Republicans are saying is, we support Speaker McCarthy and the budget that he has put forward. It's time to negotiate. And by having 43 signatures on that letter, plus a couple of other people I know that won't vote to raise the debt limit without some of these reforms or spending controls or whatever you want to call them in the budget that we're trying to get control of, the president can't get to cloture on a clean debt bill. And so that means he is going to have to negotiate. That's what that letter said. It's so important that we as Senate Republicans stand behind the House Republicans, and that's what we're doing.
So, Senator, let me ask you a couple of questions. The president, even the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer on the floor today, saying Republicans want to cut spending for veterans, they want to cut law enforcement. The president today saying they want to cut funding to firefighters during the height of wildfire season. Speak to that issue.
Yeah, I mean, let's go back and to talk about what they mean by cutting spending. They mean slowing spending down. Again, I already said that our spending overall is up 54% when it comes to 29 versus 2019. Our population is only up 1.8%. Non-defense discretionary spending is up 40%. What the House did is eminently reasonable. They started with 2022 levels and said we're only going to grow 1%. So that's still growing. It's just at a slowed rate. So they're basically scaremongering without they're saying we're going to cut all this stuff. It's not the case at all. We're starting with 2022 and saying we're slowing the growth.
Let me go back to that 54% number. Where'd that money go?
Well, some of that money was the money that came into some of the pandemic response stuff. For example, the American Rescue Plan Act had, I think, $1.9 trillion in it.
But wasn't that one-time money? Wasn't that just one-time expenditures?
And that's part of the problem when you spend money at the government. Once you put money in the budget, it's very difficult to take back out because then people think you should keep spending that money. And that's part of what Speaker McCarthy is saying. Like, hey, we got to slow down this growth. This is what he's put forward is very reasonable. Starting at 2022 and say we're just going to grow a little bit. That is something that everybody should be able to get on board with because it is so reasonable.
So that number, 2020. I mean, that's after we saw some increase in government spending. So it's not. This is not totally pre-pandemic.
Oh, this is not pre-pandemic numbers. This is 2022. This is not very long ago. And that's the whole thing. The Democrats are trying to make it seem like the sky is falling. It's like, guys, this was just last year. This was just what you lived with last year. Give me a break. We're just going a little bit more than that.
What happens if we continue on this path of uncontrolled spending?
Well, what you see is happen in other countries when they continue this path of uncontrolled spending. At some point, you can't borrow money anymore. And then what has happened in the past is that other countries will come in and restructure your debt. They'll do some loan forgiveness. They'll basically restructure the terms and kind of bail you out. The problem is when the United States of America does that, who's going to do that for us? Do you think we can rely on the People's Republic of China to do that? They're not doing it for anybody else. Why would they do it for us? This would be a very dangerous situation to get into is if we could not pay our bills anymore because we ran up our credit card too far, which is exactly why we've got to start controlling our spending now.
You mentioned these foreign countries because actually some of these foreign countries like China, Japan, others actually hold our debt right now. And that provides them some leverage. I mean, the Bible talks about the borrower being servant to the lender.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know, for example, that the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Republic of China are adversaries of ours. President Xi Jinping wants to be the world dominating power by 2049. And if he has any leverage on us, he is going to use it. And that's why we really, again, cannot allow ourselves to continue to run this level of debt and have it be held by people like the People's Republic of China.
Senator, just got about 2 minutes left. I want to switch gears very quickly to the issue of immigration. Title 42 restrictions lifted tonight at midnight. You were the governor of Nebraska. This issue of immigration is not just an issue for states on the southern border. This affects almost every state in the nation.
Absolutely. Every state is a border state. That's been a refrain of my colleagues and I for a long time because when crosses the border, whether it's people that are coming here illegally, whether it's criminals, whether it's drugs, they don't stay there. And for example, have seen a huge increase in the number of drugs that have been coming to Nebraska. In fact, fentanyl is the leading cause of death of Americans 18 to 45 in this country. Over 70,000 Americans died from that in 2021. And yet the Biden administration is doing nothing. In 2019, Nebraska law enforcement confiscated 46 fentanyl pills, just 46. Just 3 years later, that number had gone to 151,000 pills because of the president's policies to open up the border to allow anything to flow across without any real checks. So that is what's happening because of the president's terrible policies. We see fentanyl coming into our country, killing our young people like Taryn Lee Griffith, who was a single mom of two from Nebraska. She took one of these counterfeit pills laced with fentanyl and died from it. That's what the president is allowing by not securing our border.
Well, it is amazing the mess this administration has made. Senator Ricketts, good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me on.